Uh, Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session entitled Agriculture and WTO in the Time of a Pandemic, looking towards MC12. So we have been through, and we haven't been through, we are still in the middle of a horrible pandemic since last year. And we know that the MC12 was postponed from last year to this year, and important decisions on all tracks await us. So this is a session on agriculture, which we see as a critically important issue. And let me first introduce myself before I really introduce the session. I'm Ranja Sengupta. I'm senior researcher with the Third World Network, and I'm also head of its India office. And this session today is co-organized by Third World Network, the Society for International Development, and Madhyam. And so let me welcome all of you again. Let me just quickly introduce today's session. So we all know that for both developing and developed countries, agriculture, food security, agricultural livelihoods, these are absolutely critical issues. And from the beginning of the WTO has formed rules and disciplines on agriculture under 3 pillars, we know, and it remains critical. But actually, what we have been seeing currently is a relative neglect of agriculture. You know, you look at how many public forum sessions there are actually on agriculture, and I could just count I think maybe 2 or 3, but it remains critically important for developed and developing, but I would say especially for developing countries from food security and livelihood perspectives, because we have very large populations dependent on agriculture. And the WTO has been forming very important rules, which has a lot to say also about how our countries will domestically, work with their agriculture sector, what they can and cannot do. So quickly, to just flag the big issues for today, of course, we are in the middle of a pandemic. So for us, the first question will be, what has this pandemic, how has this pandemic treated agriculture and food security globally? And which are the key issues? I mean, not only in the WTO space, but globally in FAO and in other space, what are the critical discussions, critical concerns that are coming because of the pandemic? And then how do they relate to the WTO, as it goes towards the ministerial? How do these big questions link to the key issues on the table? And then let me remind you of the key issues. One, of course, we have a permanent solution mandated from the Bali Ministerial of 2013 on the public food stockholding proposal. Then we have a long standing issue of special safeguard mechanisms, which developing countries want to safeguard against very import surges. Then we have, of course, key pillar of domestic support issues, extra AMS entitlements that some countries enjoy, mainly developed countries. But also what we have seen is the neglected issue of the green box under domestic support, because there's been a lot of criticism against the green box, how some countries use it in a trade distorting manner. And speaking of domestic support, so some of these issues, the permanent solution, SSM, AMS, etc., have been long-standing issues mainly proposed by developing countries. And these are again coming up in this ministerial also for decisions. But this time we also see that, for example, the Keynes Group has made proposals on domestic support. They are asking for decisions on overall trade distorting support, but which also then targets development box subsidies given by developing countries, and also the de minimis. So it raises critical questions about how rules will be formed on domestic support. And then we see issues of export restrictions coming up. So one part of this is that countries should not should not restrict exports which are meant for the use of the World Food Program. I think most countries are agreed on this, but then there are proposals which are coming in, especially from the chair, also on actually not restricting exports of all agriculture food products. So that's one. Then we see a lot of lot of proposals and language coming from the Keynes Group, US, EU on transparency and notification. So these are just some of the issues that I flagged. But I think our overall question today will be, how can then MC12 deliver on an agricultural framework that's, that can help countries fight COVID, but that also meets long outstanding mandated issues? How can it reach decisions? And how does it kind of also meet the needs of sustainable development? With that, let me not speak anymore. Let me call on our first speaker, who is Stefano Prato. He's the Managing Director of the Society for International Development. Stefano, we are very glad to have you here today. And I want to ask you, what I was saying, that, we are sometimes disconnected actually from the discussions that are going on in FAO and other key agriculture spaces, because we are so involved with just what the WTO is doing. So I know you are very active in those spaces, apart from the financing for development issues. So we really want to hear from you. What are the concerns? What are the discussions that are going on in those fora? And how do you see them being linked to what we are discussing here on agricultural trade? Thanks, Stefano. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ranja, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Pleasure to be here with all of you. So let me try to do three things in the very short time that I have available. I'll start with what Ranja has proposed, which is looking out of the WTO window, particularly in the context of the COVID pandemic. And this will lead me to making some out-of-the-box thinking on the agreement on agriculture that comes from the priorities and the imperatives of human rights and food sovereignty. And I will then conclude with some within-the-box thinking related to the current negotiations. So let me try and do this in a very quick round. So looking out of the WTO window, three major points here. The first one is the full understanding of food systems. Food systems are the cornerstones of domestic economies, but much more than this, they're also a fundamental basis for human livelihoods. They need to first and foremost be anchored in the human rights to adequate food, and the full realization of the human rights to adequate food cannot be disjointed from the right to health, from peasants' rights in accordance to the recently adopted declaration, to women's rights, children's rights, indigenous people's rights. Fundamentally, it's impossible to look at the right to food without a very strong human rights framing on how the right food is realized in that integral and systemic manner. But food systems are not only about producing and commercializing foods. They support many public objectives across the entire 2030 agenda, and they therefore offer a fundamental locus for public policies and investment to meet a wide range of critical public goals and sustainable development goals. So it is essential to recognize that public policies and domestic policies on food systems are not only exclusively related to food security. They really address a whole variety of issues that are related to, economic livelihoods, income, support for local production systems, cultural, the relations with our ecology, and many more. But which food systems? The reality is we tend to speak about food system plural, but there is an increasing tension between a global food system, which is led by agriculture exporting countries and their powerful corporations, and local food systems, largely driven by small-scale food producers that today continue to feed the world. You know that 60–70% of food is actually produced from small-scale producers. So there is no doubt in choosing and investing in food system, which is the pathway, the sustainable pathway for domestic public policies, is that of supporting local food system, to supporting the local productive tissue, to support also short chain local system that also are able to be climate responsive and climate resilient. Now, this is the context in which we operate. This increasing tension between a multinational corporation, export-led, countries-led global food system, and the one that is really consistent with our domestic economy and our food sovereignty. Where is the WTO located into this? Well, WTO reality is neither created a liberal global market, nor it benefited developing countries, particularly those whose economies depend on the agricultural sector. Rather, it has protected powerful countries, food exporting countries, and allowed those governments to use public agricultural funds to subsidize large transnational corporations. And in all of these, it's promoted a global food system dominated by global value chains that actually created commodity dependence, relegated developing countries to the lower end of these commodity global value chains. Has therefore failed significantly to deliver on any developmental pretense, and it has unveiled its reality of being an instrument of domination that wants to extend and ossify current power asymmetries and imbalances. So this is the context of food system, and this is unfortunately the role that WTO had in all of this. Now, the context of COVID exposed clearly the shortcomings of this approach and the shortcomings of global value chains, the breaking down of global value chains, and exposed once again that our local food system will save the day, and they have a foundational role in food sovereignty, in people's livelihoods, and as the cornerstone of domestic economies. So the out of the window view is quite clear on the kind of choices that are left for public policies and investments to pursue a sustainable pathway, and the fact that the WTO doesn't quite respond or is consistent with most of this, and the COVID context has magnified this reality. So this leads me to my second point, which is some out-of-the-box thinking. You know, the out-of-the-box thinking that comes also from the activism of the food justice and food sovereignty movement is very clear. There is no role for WTO in agriculture. And we should be generally concerned with the fact that there is no WTO-centered development pathway which is able to respond to human rights, to food sovereignty, and sustainability. So the question of this out-of-the-box thinking is, why not winding down the agreement on agriculture? I mean, any assessment on the impact of this agreement on food security, on farmers' livelihood, on the actual utilization of land resources is very clear. It calls for a fundamental redesign of global agricultural trade rules. Now, abandoning the agreement on agriculture would actually leave us in a good place, because would leave us with GATT, with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, as the anchoring piece on agricultural trade law. And that's not a bad place, because GATT actually recognized the different types of economies and tried to ameliorate tensions caused by those differences without engaging in a process of regulatory harmonization. So this created actually a flexible framework without that hegemonic role of the WTO to actually explore different types of trade agreements that could be consistent with human rights and can prioritize the right to food. This would also create and strengthen a much needed trade and development space within the United Nations, starting with the role of UNCTAD and beyond. In some respect, this means playing the same game, the same forum shifting game that have been played by developed countries, you know, and creating new tensions between multilateral institutions, particularly those that can legitimately claim universal membership and democratic accountability, and other which are much more the expression of power asymmetries and power domination, and therefore limit the exponential power and hegemonic power of WTO. But I know that some of you in the context of MC12 would see some of these out-of-the-box thinking as utopian and somehow out of reach. So let me conclude with just a couple of considerations on the within-the-box thinking in context of the current negotiations on agriculture. What are the fundamentals? Well, number one, limiting the scope of permissible domestic support should be completely rejected. It's very clear that all countries should have the right to subsidize food, to protect their farmers' livelihoods, and to promote their own food systems, as long as their subsidies on other policies do not harm producers in other countries, you know, and therefore this should very clearly include the right to subsidize food for marginalized groups, including direct payments to farmer, as proposed by the Group of 33. And it is essential really to pursue this path. I think under the COVID circumstances, public stakeholder programs are shown their critical role in reducing the vulnerability of both consumers and producers, and offer buffer stocks that can stabilize prices and really ensure physical and economic access to adequate quantities of food for target population. So the fundamental pillars of the negotiations is this. Secondly, of course, developing countries should have the right to use trade instruments such as tariffs and other measures to protect the farmers' livelihoods and food security concerns, and also to face import surges from subsidized production. This takes to what Ranja has already mentioned, the critical importance of spatial safeguard mechanism, as well as the need to rethink and expand special product designations. The problem with this is that when you look at spatial safeguarding mechanism and special product designations, is you recognize how much of the devil remains in the details. And this, in some respect, brings us back to the out-of-the-box thinking. Can we really think that beyond broad policy agreements, we can negotiate down to the details of these particular mechanisms in manners that safeguard food security? And I must say, I have my very serious doubts. Third, and semi-last, we need to stop demanding expanded market access. No additional commitments on agriculture should be sought from developing countries, and particularly least developed countries. Now, this leaves us with the concluding comment, the two big elephants that remain in the room, and Ranja already mentioned, the green box subsidies and the trade distorting measure of that, together with all the entitlements related to aggregate measure of support. And lastly, the fact that the reality is that we need to recognize that today food prices are much more related to speculative and financialization driven consideration than actually traditional supply and demand consideration. And that's yet another reason to secure very strong domestic support programs. So all in all, this is the within the box thinking of the priorities, but I honestly do not think this is concretely achievable in a WTO setting, and would therefore stimulate some out of the box thinking to really support that out of the window look of where the WTO is located in the challenge for food sovereignty. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stefano, and also for reminding us, about the bigger questions that, farmers groups, for example, and agriculture food security groups have been saying for a long time that the AOA cannot solve the world's food security and livelihood problems in this sector. And therefore, we do need what you said is a redesigned, agricultural framework, trade framework. And I very much doubt whether it's coming from the MC12, but I think it will be great to hear from our next speakers. And thank you also for your reflections on the issues that's on the table at the moment. But let me call on Feni Maharani, who's the first secretary in the permanent mission of the Republic of Indonesia to the UN, WTO, and other international organizations. She is the coordinator also of the G33 group of developing countries on agriculture. So she actually, and we know the G33 has been playing a very critical role in the agricultural negotiations, not only now, but for many years now, and they've been bringing up important issues. And she's been also a facilitator on domestic support. So, and we know that those are all critical issues. Penny, we are really eager to hear from you, whether you want to speak in your capacity, on behalf of Indonesia, or we do also hope to hear a bit from you about the G33 position. But let me quickly ask you the question that I had in mind, that, for your country, and for the G33, which are the issues that you see going into MC12 that are very important, for your country, especially given the pandemic? Which are the issues that you really want to see decision on, that you cannot do without? And I would also ask, what has your group or Indonesia done to move those issues forward? What has been your actions? And then also, of course, the counter of that which issues which are on the table that you see as problematic, and that you see as an issue of concern for your country or group. Yeah, Feni, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ranja, for posting up for me that questions. I will cover actually the response to that questions in my presentation this afternoon. So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you wherever you are. Again, thank you so much, Ranja, from Third World Network for inviting me in this public forum event, which is co-organized with Society for International Development and Medium. So it is a very great honor for me to be one of the speakers together with other distinguished speakers, Stefano Prato, Professor Abhijit Das, and also, of course, my colleague, Mr. Sande Okuche of Nigeria. It's a great pleasure for me to listen and take lessons from the notable speaker earlier, Mr. Stefano Prato, which is very enlightening. So Ranja, this forum is indeed very timely and important to many of us, especially in leading to MC12, given the current pandemic as its primary background. So the topic here today, agriculture and WTO in time of pandemic, looking towards MC12 is relevant for our discussion, where agriculture is a critical issue. So first of all, I would like to share in this forum that on 16 September, about 2 weeks ago, G33 ministers have met virtually in an informal G33 informal ministerial meeting. This ministerial meetings underlines the implications of COVID-19 pandemic, particularly on food and livelihood security in developing countries and LDCs. In that regard, the G33 ministers also underscored their commitment in moving forward the agriculture negotiations in WTO on all mandated issues and the expeditious resolution of a permanent solution on public stockholding on food security purposes, or PSH, and the special safeguard mechanism, or SSM. So these two instruments in trade policy are important to address food security issues for developing members and LDCs, especially in time of pandemic. So this provides policy space to guarantee the livelihoods of small farmers. Bearing in mind that MC12 will be one of the most crucial MCs in these unprecedented times, when countries are still grappling with the COVID-19 pandemic and its aftershocks, MC12 should result in what refers to as a justice for all towards sustainable and fair trade in agriculture. The upcoming ministerial meeting in Indonesia's point of view must pave the way for a balanced, concrete, and meaningful outcomes. So Indonesia believes that such targeted outcomes in the ministerial meeting should assist members' effort in dealing with the pandemic and post-pandemic recovery, as well as in dealing with associated food security challenges. So those two are important elements for the ministerial meeting in November. So related to this matter, Indonesia has been underlining its priority outcomes in agriculture at MC12, namely the permanent solution on PSH and SSM, as well as a balanced outcome on domestic support in accordance with the Doha Development Agenda mandate. So albeit there's no one-size-fits-all policy in trade, in Indonesia's point of view, because I'm speaking here on behalf of Indonesia, a comprehensive approach on food security should consist of, first, a permanent solution for PSH instrument under WTO. PSH is a critical instrument to support farmers in developing countries because governments can be the buyer of the last resort when markets are not functioning efficiently. This mechanism provides farmers with an assurance of a minimum price for sustaining rural livelihoods. Excessive reliance on international trade for food security must not become the only option. It is important to enhance the local production and maximize domestic food production capacity. By encouraging domestic food production, countries would reduce their vulnerability of small-scale farmers and ensuring food security. And second, easy and operable SSM instrument. So the import surges can have the detrimental impacts on production and thus the food security. Hence, it is even more urgent that SSM need to be concluded in order to support countries during the COVID-19 pandemic and to build back better in the future. And third is the balanced outcome in domestic support. The large concentrated supports in key products, such as through final bound AMS entitlements, have led to subsidized imports flooding the developing countries. The small farmers across the developing world have suffered very devastating impacts in terms of production, losses of income or livelihoods, and food insecurity. Therefore, WTO rules need to be improved to ensure that domestic support does not unfairly disadvantage producers. So this is especially true with regards to domestic support pillar, which had been left unchecked in the decades by the multilateral work. On one hand, Indonesia sees that we have to promote balanced, proportionate, predictable, and transparent domestic support mechanism, especially with respect to the long, well-established domestic support programs in developed economies. While on the other hand, Indonesia believes that there are growing needs for domestic support programs in developing economies and LDCs in response to the decades of imbalanced competition in the agriculture global market. But one logical thing to underline here is that the fairness needs to take into account the disparity in the level of playing field of the farmers in the farming activities. It is, I think, our responsibility to ensure that our farmers will continue to grow their food, to continue their food crops, to feed the world, to feed our grandchildren and also our next generation. In this unprecedented situation, we recognize the need to sustain continued flow of agriculture products and food supply chain. We need to ensure that any trade measures related to agriculture in response to the COVID-19 pandemic would not result to export and import restrictions. However, we see that this must be in line with the ability of members to provide food security for its people and to ensure the most vulnerable countries could meet their demand for food, of course. So emphasizing open trade that complement the domestic production in global food system is important element for development. This is also to create balance and fair trade, as well as to ensure food security in time of crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic has affected all countries and disproportionately impacted low and middle income countries, which lead to a